Let us open our hearts to ourselves, to those sitting beside us, those here in this sacred space and time, those who are missing, those who have yet to find us. Look at all of you. You. Look how many are in the chorus. It's so beautiful. Such beautiful music. And there's still room if others want to join the chorus. As you may know, the spiritual theme for the month of March is generosity. What a coincidence that our annual fund drive happens in March. I want to read you today an excerpt from a piece written by Sharon Salzberg, who is a Buddhist teacher and author and the founder of the Insight Meditation Society in Barre, Massachusetts. Her article is entitled Generosity's Perfection. This is an excerpt from that article. The cultivation of generosity is the beginning of spiritual awakening. Generosity has tremendous force because it arises from an inner quality of letting go. Being able to let go, to give up, to renounce, and to give generously all spring from the same source. And when we practice generosity, or dana, we open up these qualities within ourselves. Letting go gives us profound freedom and many loving ways to express that freedom. Generosity is the beginning of the path. When the Buddha taught, he always began with generosity. I recall a Thai forest master who visited the West being puzzled by the sequence of teachings we seem to be following here. In Asia, he said, the teachings proceed from generosity to morality, and then to meditation or insight. But here we appear to begin with meditation, then say something about morality, and only after some time, as a kind of appendix, teach about generosity. He asked, "What's going on?" He was right to ask. We like the idea of a transformative, transcendental meditative state, and we are willing to put our effort into that. However, the springboard for genuine meditative states is the cultivation of generosity and morality. That's what allows insight to occur most gracefully and easily. The Buddha said that a true spiritual life is not possible without a generous heart. Generosity is the very first parami, or quality of an awakened mind. The path begins there because of the joy that arises from a generous heart. Pure, unhindered delight flows freely when we practice generosity. We experience joy in forming the intention to give, in the actual act of giving, and in recollecting the fact that we have given. If we practice joyful giving, we experience confidence. We grow in self-esteem, self-respect, and well-being because we continually push our limits. Our attachments say, "I will give this much and no more," or "I will give this article or object if I am appreciated enough for this act of giving." In the practice of generosity, we learn to see through our attachments. We see they are transparent. They have no solidity. They don't need to hold us back, so we can go beyond them. Therefore, the practice of generosity is about creating space. We see our limits and we extend them continuously, which creates an expansiveness and spaciousness of mind that's deeply composed. This happiness, self-respect, and spaciousness is the appropriate ground in which meditation practice can flourish. It is the ideal place from which to undertake deep investigation, because with this kind of inner happiness and spaciousness, we have the strength and flexibility to look at absolutely everything that arises in our experience. The words of Sharon Salzberg on generosity. And here I believe she was speaking not just about giving financial support, not just about money, but a generosity that's broader than that, a generosity of spirit, a generosity of heart, and we'll be returning to that theme, a generosity of spirit, in a few minutes. Roughly translated, ubi caritas means where there is charity, there is love, and there is God. Before I begin, I want to say two things. First, this is not my annual stewardship sermon. While what... All right, I wasn't going to say anything, but I've won national awards for my stewardship sermons. While what I have to say this morning does have implications on how you might choose to support this church with your annual pledge, next Sunday, as you heard from Mark, is our Commitment Sunday, and that's when I'll be giving you the hard sell, as it were, sometimes what we call the Sermon on the Amount. But today I want to talk to you about a different kind of generosity of spirit. If you choose, you might want to think of this sermon as kind of softening you up for next week's sermon. And even the choir can be here, although you're not singing. You can come. But second, and more seriously, I want to acknowledge that the story I'm going to tell you reveals the privilege that I grew up in and that I currently enjoy. I'm blessed to live in a mostly functional family that has always been financially secure. I've never worried about where my next meal is going to come from or whether I'm going to have to sleep somewhere without a roof over my head. As a child, I never wanted for anything, and today, due to your generosity, I'm still able to live in a way that is financially advantaged. I think it's important for me to acknowledge this privilege. It's important for all of us to acknowledge whatever privileges we may have grown up with or currently enjoy. Not just because I know that there are those here among us who didn't have those privileges growing up, who may have difficulty relating to the story I'm going to tell, those who had childhoods that were not simply disadvantaged but maybe truly horrible. But I also think it's important for us to acknowledge our privilege so that we can be grateful for it. So that we can be grateful for it, we name it and recognize it and be grateful for it, and affirm that with privilege comes responsibility. So with that said, I want to tell you this story. Each year when I was growing up, from the time I was about 10 years old, my parents would put my older sister Nancy and me on a plane at LaGuardia Airport and fly us down to Naples, Florida to visit my grandparents. My Nana and Pops would spend winters in Naples, which at that time at least was a relatively small town on the southwest coast of Florida. It's still on the southwest coast of Florida, of course, but it's no longer a small town. But my grandparents had a small house on a canal that led out into Naples Bay and then eventually into the Gulf of Mexico. It was a perfect location for my grandfather, who loved to fish. One of the things that I loved to do when we went to visit my grandparents was to go out on my grandfather's boat and go hunting for dolphins. Now I say hunting for dolphins, not hunting dolphins. We would go out on his boat and we'd go out into the bay and into the Gulf, and we'd try to find dolphins swimming around, and we'd try to coax them to follow us in my grandfather's boat. And if the dolphin was in the mood and you were traveling at just the right speed, you could get the dolphin to follow your boat close behind in the wake, and they'd jump out of the water almost so close that you could touch them. It was just a wonderful thing to do. Now, one of the most vivid memories I have of this time as a child, during these boat rides, as we cruised around and passed other boats, was that everyone would wave at each other. Without exception, passing each other, everyone would smile and wave at each other. It seemed like this was almost a rule of the sea but because everyone did it, but they didn't treat it like a rule. It seemed to be a joyful sort of gesture. It felt like boaters were just friendly people. A smile, a wave, and you'd go on about your business. But it left a big impression on me. So then, a few years ago, while I was visiting my parents, who were then living in my grandparents' house in Naples, same house on the same canal leading out into the same bay, into the same Gulf of Mexico, we took our children out hunting for dolphins. And I noticed something. I noticed that there weren't as many people waving. People weren't waving like they used to in my childhood. There was a marked shift in the pattern. Most boaters would look in your direction, but then they'd look away without a wave. It felt like that look was more about kind of checking you out or checking out your boat. Saying sort of like, well, mine's bigger and faster and better. Or, on the other side, boy, I wish I had a boat like yours. Sometimes these looks would feel judgmental. A quick glance your way and then away from you, you felt like the other boater was kind of dismissing you. A long, lingering gaze made you wonder, is this person going to try to board us like a pirate and take over the boat? But in either case, it felt like the seas were a lot less friendly than they were in my childhood. And so I started trying to rationalize what was going on, why people weren't waving the way they used to. And at first I attributed it to the influx of visitors that has deluged Southwest Florida since the time of my childhood. Newcomers, maybe, never learned the custom. And then I thought, well, there are a lot of rental boats out on the water, and maybe people who were just on a boat for a day had never heard about this, and when they were given instructions by the boat rental company, those instructions didn't include wave at everybody you see. I don't know. I don't know if this phenomenon, this loss of the wave, was a sign or a symptom of the downfall of Western civilization, the so-called canary in the coal mine, but it was noticeable. And just the way the waving left an impression on me as a child, the absence of the wave left an impression as well. And so over the past few years, as I've made my annual trek down to Florida and taken countless boat rides with my parents, I've been observing this phenomenon. Irene and I were in Florida just last week, and I found myself observing this wave factor as we cruised around in my parents' boat. It had become something of a social experiment for me, a litmus test on the health of society. More waves represented happier, more generous people. Fewer waves meant more judgment, more insecurity, maybe even more aggression. And as we were on my parents' boat last week, I realized something. One day, this big old light bulb went off over my head. While I was busy watching to see if other people would wave, I realized I'm not waving. I wasn't waving. I wasn't just witnessing the decline of the friendly waving boater, I was part of it. In my attempt to analyze what was going on, I lost sight of the fact that I'm not just an outside observer, some scientist watching lab rats find their way around a maze. I am a participant. I'm one of the rats. And I felt like a rat when I realized what I was doing. When I think about what it takes to have a generous spirit, to be a generous spirit, I think it starts with this, remembering that we're not just observers of others, standing apart from what's happening all around us. We are part of the world that we see. We are actors on the same stage, playing out the drama as it unfolds before us. As much as we'd sometimes like to be standing on the sidelines, offering advice or criticism or judgment, as much as we'd sometimes like to deny our role in what's happening in front of us, we are part and parcel of it. part of this larger whole. We are of this world, no matter how much we might sometimes like to deny it, especially when life isn't going exactly according to our plans. And the truth is, we aren't just bit players on the stage. We are actually scriptwriters and poets and playwrights. We are co-creators of our world, both our interior world and the world around us. As Chrissy so aptly said in her reflection earlier, and I have threatened to have Chrissy deliver the sermon while I do the personal reflection, and someday I think it'll be so. But as Chrissy said, we have power and agency. We can choose to be generous or stingy, loving or aloof, connected or isolated. We can choose to nurture or neglect our relationships. We choose to support or criticize. We choose to be open and vulnerable with others or to clam up and withdraw. Our choices matter in the world that we make, the world that we create. They matter to us and to everyone around us. Sometimes we're conscious of those choices, and sometimes, of course, we're not. And sometimes we may not feel like we actually have a choice, that we're just reacting to something that jumps up in front of us. And that's okay too, as long as maybe we spend some time afterwards and reflect on our reaction and decide, yeah, that's the way I'll choose to act in the future or not. A generous spirit is like great art or fine food. You know it when you experience it, but it's very tricky to define. We know it when we see it manifested either in ourselves or in others, this generous spirit. Recently, a friend of mine was telling me about her stepfather who recently passed away. She described him as something of a curmudgeon within the family, although she felt like she had a pretty good relationship with him. But he was very different when he was out in public, she told me. She described the neighborhood in which her stepfather lived. He had lived there all his life, and it had declined over the decades to a point where she actually, when she went to visit, was kind of afraid to go out for walks, particularly at night. But her stepdad would walk through the neighborhood almost every day. And she'd go with him sometimes. We'd come across some pretty sketchy characters, she told me. But every time my stepdad would encounter someone on the sidewalk, each and every time, no matter who it was or what they looked like, she said, he would greet them with a loud and hearty, "Hey, how you doing?" And to a person, every time she witnessed this, that person would return that greeting with a smile. That's a sign of a generous spirit, a willingness to give of oneself and give to others. Having a generosity of spirit is about being both bold and vulnerable. It's about opening our hearts up to the world and inviting the world into our hearts. It's about choosing to see the best in a particular person or situation instead of assuming the worst. There's also an element of presence in this concept too, as you heard Sharon Salzberg write earlier about the awareness you need to have a generous spirit. To have a generous spirit is to be present to the world, in the world, having an awareness of what's happening right now, right in front of us, or right perhaps inside of us. It's about being fascinated instead of frustrated, curious instead of judgmental. Consider how we react to a pushy driver who honks his horn if we don't step on our accelerator the second the light turns green. Do we get angry with him? Or do we think maybe, perhaps, he's just late picking up his child from school? And what about that woman ahead of us in the grocery store line who's fumbling through her purse trying to find that coupon she knows is in there somewhere? How do we react to her? And how do we react when we're that woman fumbling through our purse? Are we frustrated or are we generous with her or with ourselves? The Dalai Lama tells us that generosity is the most natural outward expression of an inner attitude of compassion and loving kindness. When one desires to alleviate the suffering of others and to promote their well-being, he writes, then generosity in action, word, and thought is the desire put into practice. And so generosity of heart, generosity of spirit begins at home with the cultivation of an inner attitude of compassion and loving kindness. As in most matters of the spirit, we must first tend our own garden, first cultivate this inner attitude, and then act upon it. And to practice it upon ourselves, too. We can't forget that. We need to practice this generosity on ourselves, especially when we feel like smushing that little bird. Sitting on my parents' boat on a sunny afternoon in Florida last week, I had this epiphany. In watching others not wave, I had forgotten to wave myself. I had become stingy and miserly with my wave, judgmental of those who pass by without waving, without even giving so much as a nod in my direction. And so from that point forward, I decided to try a different kind of experiment, a very simple one. Very simple. I committed to wave first. I committed to wave first. Not to wait for another boater to wave and then react or respond, but to extend the greeting to everyone we passed, and then let them respond as they would. I was going to be extravagant in my waving, to wave early and often. And I was going to add a big smile, too. I was going to say through this gesture, like my friend's stepdad, "Hey, how you doing?" And you know what? Most people waved back. Not everybody, but most people waved back, and they smiled too. And I'd like to think that they then waved first at the next boat that passed them by, but that's not really the most important thing. Because the really important thing is what happened inside of me. By choosing to wave first, I felt my heart open up to the world. I let go of my judgment around people who didn't wave or who waited to wave. I didn't wonder what had happened to the world of my childhood that I so longed for. By the simple act of waving first, I recreated that world for myself and perhaps for others. And maybe, just maybe, it's as simple as that. To nurture a generous spirit in ourselves, to birth generosity and joy into the world, all we have to do is wave first. This day and every day, I wish you peace. Amen.
Our closing words this morning come from a volume of meditations and suggestions by David Morrell entitled Be Generous.